Okay, so I'm excited to be here in CANactions School Life. Happy to be back to the CANactions program, even if it's through the digital platform. I got an invitation some weeks ago to give a lecture about basically any topic regarding our work, and let's say we at the office prepared a presentation that's called 5 Books That Affect Our Practice: Systemic Design for Contingency. And well, I'm going to tell you a little bit about what we're up to. First, as Anastasia from CANactions asked me, I'll tell you a little bit about what's happening here with the quarantine in Colombia. We're actually in the office, we're doing fine. We have fortunately plenty of work, although projects locally are a little bit delayed. But fortunately, we're doing things elsewhere, and therefore, let's say we're busy and safe. On the other hand, let's say, to give people a little bit of context, my name is Julian Restrepo. I'm a Colombian architect. I've met the CANactions program back in 2011 when we participated in a competition that we won for the shore and central part of Kiev, when Kiev meets the Dnieper River. And from then onwards, we've been collaborating with CANactions on different programs, did a workshop for Chernobyl. And we currently nowadays have offices here in Bogota, Colombia. We have a new found office nowadays in Amsterdam, in the Netherlands. And we have also a studio space for projects in China. So let's say, with that in mind, I'll tell you a little bit about what we're doing now. And when we started to think about this lecture, the first thing that came to mind was, okay, like how can we approach the quarantine? How can we approach this time that we have to sit down in our homes and, let's say, do some introspection or study certain topics? And I chose to do this lecture about 5 books and start with the 5 books because I think the ability to read, the extended ability to read in these current times is valuable, and we should all try to embrace it in a way and try to find opportunities for growth. So let's say I chose these 5 books because not necessarily because we've read them in this quarantine, but they're part of our, let's say, library of important books that we've read recently that are shaping and building our worldview, and therefore how we approach the profession and, let's say, our let's say, work. So I chose 5 books that I recommend them to read. I'll go over all of them, and then I'll tell you about a couple of projects on how are we applying these notions and these lessons that these books leave us to our professional field. So the first book I read a couple of years ago, it's called Stream Cities by Ashley Dawson, and I think it was an eye-opener because it talks about our reality regarding climate change. And when I talk about that, I know it's been talked about extensively, but for the first time in this book, I really understood what it could imply to architecture and to cities. Firstly, in this slide, you can see like the global average temperature change. Best case scenario, the change is 1 degree, but 1 degree average for the whole world means that there will be areas of the world where the difference will be 10 degrees average. And that has serious implications for, let's say, the ecosystems and for the way we're used to the way we used to live and to develop our sustainable systems, food, economy, travel, whatnot. And then also, let's say, because of this temperature rise, we know that the ice caps are melting, and this map here shows how, let's say, the water level will rise and will engulf a lot of what nowadays are coastal cities. There are over 500 coastal cities, important coastal cities around the world, and most of them will be, let's say, underwater in the next couple of 100 years. So that has a direct implication on how we are building our environment, and the future of these cities is in jeopardy. And however, let's say all of the cities we're building the same way. You know, this is Hong Kong, but it could be Shenzhen, it could be almost any densely built city in the world at this moment. So cities have become generic, and cities are not designed to really resist change, you know, and especially the change that's coming. This is an image from Miami, which is one of the important cases that they portray in the book, where they show how Miami, even though it is a city from the US and one of the most famous cities in the world, is under very big jeopardy around climate change. And let's say not only because of the sea level rise, but because, let's say, the sea level rise is moving down the aquifers that where they get their drinking water. And let's say, therefore, it's putting their whole system of livelihood in jeopardy. So what do we do with a city like Miami? Or let's say, what do we do with a city like New York? New York is like the epitome of the dense city. And let's say, if you see like the perfect grid of New York, and let's say it's almost it's completely man-made structure, it contrasts a lot with the reality of, let's say, former New York. This is a plan showing the topography of New York, or Manhattan specifically, before it became, let's say, the city that we know, versus a city like Bogota. And when you see it, let's say, when you see the plan of the city of Bogota, you see that it responds to its geographical, let's say, limits. However, when you look at the plan in New York, it's completely different. Like, there was this ecology, there were these hills, mountains, and rivers that are completely erased. And let's say, as this image of the wanderer in the Sea of Mist, we, let's say, came into New York, and we decided to impose our view of development over nature. And then this happened, you know. And this is a picture by Ivan Van that shows what Hurricane Sandy did to one of the most famous cities in the world, if not the most famous one, where half of Manhattan was completely out of light. The metro was flooded in a lot of parts of the city. And the city went through a very difficult time, because precisely we thought we could simply overrun nature and build ourselves over it. There is another case in the book, which I think it's worth mentioning, which is Jakarta, you know, and Jakarta in Indonesia is sinking. It has the same problems as Miami. It has a greater risk than New York. And this project here, it's called the Garuda project. And it's a project done by Dutch companies that want to, or pretend to, build this huge wall that secludes Jakarta from the sea. It's a trillion dollar project, and they're going to build that to try to stop, you know, the sinking of Jakarta, and having the city, let's say, maintain its original functions and its original structure. However, the book, let's say, implies or poses some important questions that I think are worth asking. And let's say, in my particular case, that I had never asked myself before this, which is, what is it worth investing, I don't know, $70 trillion to save a city? Or is it more intelligent to rebuild the city elsewhere? What will happen with a lot of these cities? We won't win the fight with the sea or with climate. So how do we adapt? How do we adapt the existing cities? And how do we decide which cities will survive and which will not, and will have to be moved? These questions are rarely spoken of. We think that cities are eternal, and we think that they should be in the same place that they have always been. But let's say history has shown us that that is not necessarily the case. And now we're faced with the same challenges at this point in history, but now we're not talking about a single city in a country. We're talking about a lot of cities in different places. How are we going to deal with these topics? How do you dismantle a city, and how do you build a city from scratch? So upon reading this book, I started investigating and researching more on these topics. And this led me to this book, which is called After Nature. And I think After Nature has great insights because, let's say, it gave me a lot of feedback on what actually nature is, because everybody says, yeah, climate change is terrible. We've, let's say, used the ecological resources we have at hand. We've overused them. And therefore, let's say, we are putting the planet in jeopardy, changing its weather. We, let's say, damage nature. But what is nature? And what will happen to nature? And this book gives us insights on that, because the question of what is nature is more difficult than you would think initially. A lot of people think nature is what's green, or what grows. But actually, what the book is telling us is that the definition of nature has changed through time. So, for example, say this picture by one of the US's most famous painters, Frederick Edwin Church, The Heart of the Andes, tries to portray this idea, this almost idyllic idea of nature. This was trying to represent Alexander von Humboldt's travels through Latin America. So it shows like the mountain ranges, the dense and tropical vegetation, the presence of water, rivers, and that is what nature was in theory, But let's say this keeps varying, because initially, we thought nature was for humans, and it became our like the Garden of Eden. Everything in nature was placed for our personal use. So let's say the fruits were there for us to take, the water was there for us to drink. We were the center of the universe. And with that vision, we started expanding. But then we started thinking through time that nature was completely sacred, and a lot of the environmentalist movement is born with this idea notion, nature, we are not the center of the universe. Nature is sacred, and let's say we are the disease. And with that idea, we glorified nature. And a lot of the environmentalists say, okay, we cannot touch nature. Nature is sacred. We are the problem in this world. And let's say, therefore, we have to protect it at whatever cost. But the reality with this mindset is that it is not sustainable in the long run. Like, nature is very important. It's part of our system. But if we think it's sacred, we won't be able to interact, and we won't be able to develop like our society and our livelihood for the better. So in a way, what current trends are talking about is that nature is a balance of forces. And a balance of forces means that, let's say, both humans and the natural environment are important and need to be balanced out. And this is particularly relevant for us architects or urbanists, because, let's say, it changes our decision-making skills and systems. We are not, when we know that we're not the center of the universe, then we respect, let's say, our environment better. But also, we know that we need to interact with it. It's not good enough to just, let's say, seclude our ecological structures and try to protect them. We do need to be able to balance our actions over the environment so that both humans and the natural environment can thrive. This image I like a lot because, let's say, it shows the balance of forces that we need to take into account. Like Earth is, let's say, a piece of rock floating in space, where there's water and there's air that make up the Earth as we know it, with all of its ecological systems. And yet nowadays, there's also another layer of information, or that is very important, and another system that we need to take into account, and which is in this case represented by like this digital network. But basically what I'm referring to is culture. You know, we are part of the system and an important part of it. So we need to be able to interact with it. We are, let's say, part of this evolutionary scale, and let's say we are not completely apart from it. We are, let's say, the consequences of nature, and therefore, let's say, all of our decisions have to be taken into account within this structure. That led me to this other book, which is called The Overstory. And The Overstory is a novel, like compared to the other two books, which are more technically and data driven. This one is a narrative. It's a fictional narrative. But I love the book. I thought it was also an eye-opener in the sense that it goes deeper into our understanding and our relationship with nature, and especially with trees. And let's say I like to show this image because it was one of the ideas and notions that I think is let's say more difficult to see or perceive, you know, which is what happens. Like, we know plants and trees are beautiful, they give us air, they're part of the environment, but we rarely talk about the underlying systems that they are, let's say, composing and building. And this image shows that, you know, you see a plant. This is the root systems of prairie plants in the US. And you see a plant which is mainly a shrub or a couple of flowers. But when you look at what's below it, you see these hyper complex systems, sometimes which is even bigger than what you are used to see as the plant itself. And all of these root systems are entangled together and make up, let's say, our forests, make up our what we call and perceive as nature. So let's say the book is very good at explaining to us how, let's say, it's not just about planting trees. It's about rich ecosystems where a lot of things happen, and let's say everything needs to be linked together. And I think this book shows this idea better than I've seen it elsewhere, because it's also our relationship with this environment. This is an image that I found that I think it's amazing, that shows this diagram, but in photography, and the complexity of what we're talking about. Because at the end of the day, and it's something that the book is very well at portraying, is that, let's say, the whole forest usually is a network of roots that are communicating constantly within each other. Like, as humans, that we are groups that need others to survive. Like, trees are also entangled and communicating with themselves, with other trees, and with other species like fungi or different types of plants. So this whole picture here you see of a forest from above. Well, all of these plants are actually communicating with each other. And when we are cutting down forests, and when we are doing just monoculture, what we're really doing is we're eliminating this diversity that, let's say, is required for life to thrive, you know. And that is very important, especially nowadays, that a lot of people talk about planting, and that we have to plant trees, and let's plant 100,000 trees, let's plant 500, a million, 350 million, whatever the number. But it's not only about that. It's about building rich ecosystems, you know, because we can plant the same tree 100,000 times and it won't be the same. So this image here of an old American forest, you know, shows the complexity of the system. You have the moss, you have the fungi, you have the low-lying shrubs, you have the tall trees. If we're going to do, let's say, if we're going to do landscape design, how can we incorporate these ideas into our designs, you know, instead of just making it pretty, instead of just, let's say, trying to put a couple of species of trees that for our eye are pleasing. And the system is much more complex than that, because it's not only trees but the water. And this image I love because it's about, it shows the main rivers of the world and the network that they form, and how it's just part of one whole system. If we look at Colombia, which is our home country here, well, you can actually define the shape of the country by looking at its rivers without any need for borders. And I love this image because it shows, let's say, how, let's say, a country is rich in water, where and how is the weather. You can actually see the different regions of Colombia in one single image, which is amazing. And this is Ukraine, just in case you guys were wondering, where you see the presence of the Dnieper River as, let's say, the main access of the country, and how, let's say, the rest of the country is almost evenly distributed. And also talking about the topography and the different types of weathers you have. You even see a little bit of the Carpathian Mountains on the left of the image, on my left at least. And again, this is part of a more complex system, you know, how the streams become rivers, how the rivers lead to oceans. And let's say when you blend the two systems together, you get what we perceive as the natural environment. This is a satellite photograph of the Amazon River, which is one of the most ecologically diverse and rich areas in the world. And it's a mixture of this network of trees and vegetation and this network of waterways that are vital to our well-being, you know. So let's say after reading that, I came across this book, which is called Donut Economics. And let's say it takes on a different approach to all of these ideas that I've been talking about. Because the first book was giving me like a sense of worry. Like, okay, this is happening. This is much more complex than we thought it would be. And this leads to a new way of looking at urbanism, at cities, at development, at architecture itself. Then I started going deeper into what nature was, and you understood the complexity of it. But then how can you take that and apply it into the real world, let's say? Because we've heard of thousands of environmentalist movements that cry for help, but we don't see sometimes how that can become a reality. So this book showed me a little bit of what could be one of the options we have into incorporating this mindset and this worldview into our current systems. This book, Donut Economics, is like a manifesto that tells us what, again, what we already know. We have one Earth, this is our home, and if we keep growing in population numbers and in, let's say, resource use, we would need an Earth which is, let's say, 6 times the size of it to be able to sustain our standards of living. So this is unsustainable. And if it is unsustainable, it will collapse. And if it collapses, then we will obviously be in jeopardy. That's why it's important that we shift our focus, that architects shift their focus from, let's say, worrying too much about styles and starting to attend the urgent problems that are arising in the world. And here, I forgot to change it to English, but these are the Sustainable Development Goals from the United Nations. And these are the topics that we should be dealing with as architects, you know, in order also, let's say, to become more relevant and more useful to the current state of the world. But the book in itself talks about a new development model that is not based on eternal growth. So this is basically a book about economics, but I think we as architects need to incorporate more economics into our discourse and of our understanding of the world. So the theory is that eternal growth is impossible, and I think that is fairly easy to understand, because we live in a planet that is not infinite. It has finite resources, And what Kate Rafford does here in the book is, instead of doing this eternal line upwards where you just keep growing companies, growing, let's say, our population, and demand is what moves the development of the world, she devises what she calls the donut, which is basically an economical ceiling, ecological ceiling, which is our limit, the limits we have in our planet, so that the planet doesn't, let's say, degrade and is not able to recuperate. And a social foundation, which is, let's say, a minimum standard of living for everybody in the world. And we as humans should inhabit the green area, this safe space that is, let's say, between the ecological ceiling and the social foundation. And the ideal development for companies, for countries, for cities is a development that stays within this margin. Because what's happening now is something like this. Basically, we are, let's say, overshooting the resources we have for the planet, and we're losing biodiversity. We are changing this land conversion element. We're changing complex ecosystems and forests into, let's say, monocultures or deserts. Climate change is happening at an extremely fast rate, and we're not being able to fight it. But let's say it has also problems within the social foundation, because we are also not being able to provide for everybody in the world enough quality of life, so that they have at least a minimum, let's say, minimum resources or minimum means of sustainability. So let's say we need to go within these limits. And when you think about it like that, you start making different decisions around cities. It's not only about economic growth. How can we lead to more investment? How can we grow our companies? How can we grow our cities? It's about how do we make them also sustainable and adaptable to the whole world, And that led us to this document. I don't know if you guys saw, but the last couple of weeks, I think, or 3 weeks, time is different to understand in quarantine, but recently anyway, Amsterdam was the first city to declare itself part of the donut economico, and they did this first document. Now I'm going to show you some extracts from it that show that they are trying to change their model for what a good city is to the donut model, so that, let's say, Amsterdam starts to contribute into a more sustainable environment. And basically, they start by asking these 4 questions, which are, let's say, the first big question is, how can our city be a home to thriving people in a thriving place while respecting the well-being of all people and the health of the whole planet? So if you see this question, it's not only about us, but it's about the whole world. And it's something that this virus has made pretty obvious, if it wasn't already. If, let's say, we cannot, as a city or as a country, we cannot be great if the rest of the world is not, let's say, being sustainable. It's not actually fulfilling everybody's needs and goals. So it's recognizing that we are part of a bigger system. So socially, what would it mean for the people of Amsterdam to thrive? What is our definition of to thrive nowadays? What would it mean for Amsterdam to thrive within its natural habitat? So we are part of, let's say, a bigger system. Even what happens in respect to the whole planet. How are we contributing as a city to the development of the planet? And what would it mean for Amsterdam, not only for its people, but also, let's say, for the well-being of the people worldwide. And that, let's say, leads to a lot of different decision-making skills. It's not buying what is cheapest. It's understanding what you're buying and where does it come from. Are the people, let's say, used to produce it being properly remunerated, for example? And they take this to the next step, which is, okay, recognizing the specific challenges of a city like Amsterdam. I was telling Pablo, my business partner, the other day that, let's say, what makes sense is to have one of these donuts for every country, for every city, even maybe for whole neighborhoods or regions, where you understand within the donut where you're at, you know. And this is the analysis made for Amsterdam. So you see that they are very well in air pollution, for example, but climate change is a problem. And each of them will be slightly different depending on the scale of analysis. But it gives you a tool to make decisions in the long run. This picture I wanted to share with you guys because, let's say, from the start of the year, we have an office in Amsterdam, actually. And we're very glad to be part of the city nowadays, of the city fabric, and also are interested in making part of its innovators ecosystem, so that we keep analyzing, working, and seeing how to implement this further, and also seeing how the city, let's say, implements something that is very innovative. And I'm sure that a lot of cities will follow in the next few decades. And the last book I was going to talk to you about before I jump into the project is this one that I recently got, called Low Tech: Design by Radical Indigenism. This is a book that it's not only, let's say, graphically beautiful, and I think the research is very valid, but I think it shows us of a different way of looking at the world. And let's say if we see all of the books that I've talked about, they show this impending doom, more or less, if we don't do anything about it. But the solutions are not that clear, at least from an architectural perspective, you know? Like, okay, yes, we need to be more sustainable, but what does it mean? And this book shows how, let's say, local knowledge from indigenous people around the world is more relevant than ever, you know, for the solutions of what needs to be done in the future. A lot of the times we've been taught, because we come from a neurocentric vision of the world, which values development and knowledge, let's say traditional knowledge, university knowledge, let's say, as the highest quality of culture you can have. But and historically, and even if it happens to us that we come from a low income country, and that we don't see the value in these indigenous expressions for architecture, for cities building, that we see them as something secondary or almost anecdotic. But I think they're more relevant than ever. And for example, this is a bridge in India that is built with roots. And it takes years to build a bridge. But what I think is worth mentioning here is that, let's say, this bridge can withstand any flood that comes along the way. Like, we in Colombia have had tremendous tragedies because bridges are cut, because population is killed, because we're trying to build as we are building all over the world without really understanding the natural systems we are getting involved with. And let's say, what I think is most valuable about this type of architectural expressions is that they fully understand the role of humans within the natural system, and therefore can devise solutions that can actually work and be sustainable in the long run. This is, for example, a place that we even visited some years ago, which is in Lago Titicaca in Peru. And these islands you see here are completely man-made. They're almost weaved, and they support the houses and, let's say, the schools, and everybody moves around in a boat. So I think this is a great example of how can you build around water when, for example, water has become uncertain. You know, in Colombia, we've had floods that killed hundreds of people because the houses that are next to them are built as they are built everywhere in the world without taking into account the local complexities. So what if, for example, we can build the next future of houses around water that they can actually float? It is so basic, a lot of people discard it as an option, but here you see that it is actually, let's say, a sustainable way of living, that if you combine the knowledge we have, like this ancestral knowledge, with, let's say, the way we build things, I think we can it can lead to much better solutions, to the problem. This is another picture from Peru. This is Moray, and this was an Inca laboratory thousands of years old, where they grew plants and looked at how plants behaved in different ecosystems. So basically, it was like a big botanical research center for food and for agronomy. This is something you rarely see nowadays, and they were doing it 2,000 years ago with a very simple system. A few kilometers away from that, it's this salt mine in Maras. It's also in Peru. And this is a natural salt mine carved by the Incas, like, I don't know, more than 1,000 years ago, and it still works. And it's a way to extract salt from nature without having to have any industrial process, but it's at an industrial scale. So you can actually have very efficient systems that work with nature without having to necessarily destroy it. And that led me to start thinking about, let's say, what our role is as Colombians, as Latin Americans in the world. Because I think the world is in a state of flux, that it's not just about looking at what, let's say, Europe is doing or the US is doing and following their lead blindly, but it's also about looking within different cultures, these ancestral cultures, and saying, okay, what do we have to offer and how can we be part of the solution, and not keep trying to implement, like being eternally convinced that whatever comes from these two places is, let's say, the best solution possible. Latin America is a continent that can and will be further developed. We can do it in a completely different way, and I hope we do so. And we as an office will try to be part of that change. So those are the 5 books, but what do you do with those 5 books? How can that filter into architecture and what we're doing now? We're not proposing just to go out and start building bridges with trees, It needs to be implemented in a way that it may look more realistic. So that's why here I'm showing that there are like three circles on 3 different countries, which is where we're working at right now. Obviously, our main base is Colombia and Bogota, where I'm currently at now. The Netherlands, let's say it's our second home, where our other studio is and where we're starting to work. And also China. And China, I think it's one of the best places to be at the moment, not also because they're already, let's say, past the worst part of the quarantine, but also, let's say, because it is a laboratory for innovation nowadays. So today I'll talk about what we're doing in China and how we're trying to incorporate some of these ideas and notions into our workflow, which is not to say that we've completely done it. This is an ongoing thought process. This is an ongoing architectural, like, design process that, let's say, from what we're learning on, because I think the theory is pretty clear, and everybody wants to have a better place. Everybody wants everything to be more sustainable, but then how do we make it a reality with the constraints we have in terms of budgets, with the realities we have in terms of laws, and in terms of people's perception of what should be done. Since 2 years ago, not last time I was in Kyiv, but let's say when I went there to give a lecture and do a workshop in Chernobyl, we started working in China, and we joined forces with a couple of other Dutch offices, Lola Landscape and Land and Civilizations Compositions, also, let's say, part of the CANactions network. And we went to work in Shenzhen, China. And Shenzhen, I think it's one of the most exciting cities to work now around the world because of the speed of change and because, let's say, of their ambitions as a city. So Shenzhen is a port city, part of the China's economic revolution. I would say one of the, let's say, main protagonists of China's economic revolution, when Deng Xiaoping, let's say, did the aperture of China as an economic power, then Shenzhen was one of these special economic zones that quickly developed as a port and quickly moved on into being one of the technological hubs from the world. They say that 85% of the electronic components used in all equipment around the world come from Shenzhen. And they've been building at an incredibly rapid pace, high rises, housing, and from a few years ago, parks and public spaces. Shenzhen, for those who don't know, was not even a city 40 years ago. It was the small town between Hong Kong and Dongguan and Guangdong and the Guangdong region, you know. And most people that went there in the 80s don't even remember a city because, let's say, that was what you saw when you went to Shenzhen. You know, this is the landscape that you could see when you arrived, and that was the part of the city that could even be called a city. But nowadays, it's a city that has over 10 million inhabitants. The population growth has been more than 6,000% since 1985. And it keeps growing. Shenzhen is also, let's say, one of the important cities for the Chinese government to show what the future of cities should be like. And in the center of Shenzhen, you see this developed, completely modern city. But when you look at it better, you see that there is always sustainable transportation. So there is this huge bike rental system. All of the bus systems are electric. All of the taxis are electric. All of the motorcycles are electric. So it is a very healthy city in a way. The vegetation there is beautiful. I love going to Shenzhen and looking at how they do urban landscaping. Because let's say what I like about it, and it's particularly important for us Latin Americans, it's to understand how can you do, let's say, tropical landscape design properly, you know, because here our streets are modeled out of European cities and out of, let's say, American cities, where here you can clearly see this is not a European city because of the vegetation you use, because of how they use it. It is clearly a tropical city. And I think we need to incorporate these languages back to our city building strategies. As I told you before, Shenzhen is, let's say, a city that grew tremendously fast. And let's say the old Shenzhen, which is these urban villages you see here in the picture, you know, are being raised to build these high rises to accommodate the increasingly dense population and livelihood the city has. So these urban villages are sold, you know, the owners sell these villages and they lead to these high dense cities. Obviously you lose some richness that these urban villages have, but it leads the way quickly to a new type of development. These urban villages are called handshake buildings because they are so close, so packed together that you could actually take your hand out and say hello to the neighbor from the building in front. We stayed there one of the first times we went there. It's quite the experience. And let's say it is part of the ever-changing fabric of Shenzhen that, let's say, if you see this axonometric view that I found on a billboard walking through the city, you see that everything that is being rebuilt is leaving a lot of green space around it. So they do have a notion of, let's say, integrating better with their natural systems, you know. And China probably is very famous because it's one of the main polluters in the world at the moment, but it's taking these tremendous steps forward to build different cities and to change this, let's say, not only the perception, but the actual numbers. And let's say from the last couple of years that we've been flying to China a lot, we've seen changes happen at a pace that is impossible to see anywhere else in the world. Even so that they are doing a public space and parks revolution, and that's why, let's say, we went to work there, and that's why we're working there. There was a competition announced back in 2018 for a forest and sports park in Guangming, which is in the outside of Shenzhen. Here you see the site on the right, and here on the left you see like Colombia's biggest park. So already this park that was only on the outskirts of the city is several times bigger than our biggest park. It was our first time in China. It was our first time working in a high-profile competition like this one. This was the printing of the panels in the Netherlands, the trial panels. And then this was us. This is Jason and Peter, like looking at the final booklet that we were going to deliver and the presentation we were going to do for the jury. This is just minutes before the presentation. I have to say I was pretty nervous. And these are our competitors. One of the competitors was SWA, which is a huge landscape office based in the US, but has offices in a lot of countries around the world. They did a proposal and were one of the finalists. James Corner from Field Operations, also a British architect, but with his office in America and projects all around the world. And TCL, which is an Australian landscape office that also does very interesting work, let's say, around Australia and the region. This is where we had to present to the jury. These are our panels. I found this place very curious. It had a very old building that was the cafeteria within the space. But this was it, you know. We had to present. We had like 20 minutes to present in front of a jury, not only of local Chinese experts, but also foreign architects. And this is the project we presented, it was called Cradle Forest and Guangming Town Forest and Sports Park. And we based all of our design around innovation. So this is the Pearl River Delta, which is the area where Shenzhen is located. This was also like 50 years ago. This is the Pearl River Delta now. It's the densest area in the world. It hosts almost 100 million people living in an area which is not bigger than most cities are, you know. And let's say in the outskirts of the city, you know, they wanted to have this sports park that integrates or that makes a transition between the city fabric and, let's say, the mountain and the forest. This is the plan of the site. So the park had different areas, one more urban, one much more contemplative and natural. And let's say we focused on innovation because of the innovating character of Shenzhen, but also because we thought it would be an opportunity to try new things out. And that's where I start, let's say, integrating these ideas we have and we read in the previous books. Here, when you analyze this forest, you see that actually everything is man-made, it's artificial, and it has a lot of monoculture, you know. So there is not huge ecological diversity. Although it looks natural, it's not necessarily natural because everything has been planted there. So there is an opportunity here to innovate. And here you can see in the picture that it doesn't really have this past rich ecological richness that it could and should have. So we saw it as an opportunity. We said, okay, why don't we build a research and botanical center within, let's say, the site, the part where we can intervene around this little lake here, and that can extend, you know, the plants and the diversity to the rest of the park, so we enrich the ecology of the place, almost like what we were showing in Peru, that they had this botanical and research and agronomical area. We would have that too, and that would become, let's say, the system to enrich the ecology of the park, introducing not only trees, but the shrubs and different kinds of vegetation. And around the lake, we would build some of the other functions that the park needed to enjoy the ecology. So you would have this slow transition between the lake that was the center, this reservoir that was the center of the project, and the mountains, as it kept going up and up and up, let's say, the activities and the natural qualities would change accordingly. We also looked at sports. It was about the forest and sports, and also we can do innovation in sports. And that is something that people are not very aware of, but the reality is that sports are not something stable and static in time. And by doing a quick research, we started noticing that actually it has evolved a lot. And let's say nobody played football, 200 years ago. Nobody knew about basketball even 100 years ago. And new sports will keep appearing and will keep evolving. So in this sense, we saw that, let's say, around the lake, we had the opportunity to innovate sports. We are innovating in nature, but we were also looking into innovating in culture. And what we did is take an existing road around the lake and set it up as a loop of activities where we would have these multi-fields, which are these plugs that you see there around the main loop, where you can actually do not only the traditional sports, but new types of activities and recreation. So each field was different because what we wanted to do is really open up the possibilities of what can be done, of what sports can be exercised or invented if you don't have like the traditional soccer field, the traditional basketball field. So this is an image from above of the project. And here you see a combination of elements which I think are worth talking about. You see, let's say, the multi-fields, which are divided by surface. So we have sand sports in one area, we have water sports in one area, in another one, let's say the surface is rubber, in another one it's grass, so that you can actually host different kinds of events there. But you can also see here two buildings, which are important to mention. This one, which is the Sports Research and Development Center, and this one, which is the Botanical Development Center. And the other part of the project is that along the loop, we devised a nursery, and you can see it here in the planting, so that, let's say, we grow plants that we can then take to the forest to be able to diversify it and make it more ecological. And this is, let's say, the image of the lake with these sports fields, these multi-fields, and the R&D. But let's say, what could we do with the forest? Obviously, let's say the intervention should be much less intense. But what we did is set up a network of trails so that, let's say, people could enjoy the forest and the mountain also by hiking and walking. So we devised a trail system for people that have, let's say, the physical qualities that are able to, let's say, walk up a mountain. But we also devised a red path that would give universal access to the mountainside. And that became very important for us, because nowadays what happens is that if you're not in good physical condition, you won't be able to access the forest, especially in this area, which has a lot of topography, and the mountain is steep. So we devised this red path, which was basically an infrastructural element for pedestrians only, where, let's say, you can have a steady slope of 5%, and you can walk up the mountain and connect the different, let's say, activities from the park. So here you see, let's say, how the line goes into the mountain. And this is an image of how the park starts, let's say, as being part of the city. It almost looks like an urban park, but it quickly transitions to a more natural environment. And the red path, let's say, moves along and keeps a stable slope, so that you can actually walk up the mountain without much effort, leading and connecting to special moments like this viewing tower that we're going to have in the park. There is me finishing the presentation. I was very scared. Never been more scared in my life, actually, presenting a project. And this is after the presentation. We were relieved. we didn't expect much of our first competition in China, because we were just learning, and we were competing against pretty big names. So for us, being able to do, let's say, a good participation, being able to, let's say, just be good as the others in the competition was already, let's say, our main objective. We didn't expect much from that. We were taken to a very Chinese lunch where we had to eat pigeon for lunch and enjoy China's delicacies. And 2 hours later, we found out that we were one of the 2 finalists for the competition. So competitions in China always work in the same way. You have, let's say, an organizer that does like a short list. We were already part of that short list. We have to present a project, maybe between 4 and 8 teams. And then we have to, let's say, present, if we are selected and we are the final 2 or the final 3, we have to present a second time to the government, because at the end of the day, it's always the government that decides who the winner is. So we were very happy. We had achieved a second place, which was already more than we were imagining we would get. So who was the other finalist? It was James Corner from Field Operations, of course. If you guys don't know him, he was the designer of the High Line in New York, and he's the designer of a lot of important landscape projects around the world. For example, the design of the whole area for the Olympic Games in 2012 in London, among hundreds of other projects around the world. And 3 days later, we had to again present to the government. This is the headquarters of the local government in Guangming. And here is the government and his close advisors. And there we presented, and we were not nervous then. Let's say we didn't expect to win. So who cared if, let's say, we won or lost? We had already done, let's say, what we came to do. We just enjoyed it and explained the project. And 2 hours later, we were celebrating, the 3 of us, because we actually won the competition. And for us, it was a big surprise. And we were ecstatic about the possibility of doing such a project in China. Here are the celebrations at Lola in the Netherlands. Here was the celebration in Bogota for the Colombian office. And let's say that led us to a whole series of competitions and opportunities in China that we keep working there, and that currently are at the moment are part of our sustainable, let's say, business environment. Because while here in Colombia everything is stopping, in China things are already underway. This other project I want to show you guys, because I think it's also a good example of how to implement the ideas from the books on how to do public space in a different way. And this is also a competition where we were one of the finalists. We actually came in second place, but let's say we got to design the project we did for the competition. So we're very happy developing it right now. And this is also in Shenzhen, in the outskirts of Shenzhen, but this is a new area of the city called Qianhai. And Qianhai, let's say, it's a huge master plan, and that is currently being developed. And we had to design a linear park and public space system for, let's say, this area here in red, where it's basically around 2 kilometers long. And we started working with a concept that we've tried to continuously work on, which is the city biotopes. What we did basically is to analyze what type of different biotopes are existing within the region of Shenzhen. And not only the natural biotopes, but also what we call the cultural biotopes, which is basically, let's say, how there are cultural spaces and, let's say, different types of ecosystems, and how can the two, let's say, interact with each other, because again, that's what a city should be, an interaction between systems. This public space connects the Shenzhen Bay with the Guiyang River and the Dananshan Park. So we thought, okay, how can we start doing public space in a different way and not just, let's say, replicating like a linear park that we see in most areas of the world, which is just choose a profile and extend it for a certain amount of time. We started, let's say, trying to understand what type of facilities, cultural facilities, were important, and how can we relate them to the different biotopes. We chose 4 biotopes for this project: the wetland biotope, the jungle biotope, the meadow, and the bamboo hills for this particular park. And we started analyzing what it implied to try to build an artificial ecosystem. We know it's artificial. We're not pretending to fake nature, but how can we enrich it with the qualities these ecosystems usually have? And what we started seeing is that there was the opportunity to do a transition. Like nature almost never has like this clear-cut line where you have jungle and meadow, for example. It's always a transition where things flow into each other. How can we make public space so that, let's say, we are actually building ecosystems that flow into each other? And so here you see how we divided the area between the wetland, the jungle, the meadow, and the bamboo hills, and how we start breaking this notion of let's say, just cutting the type of vegetation and finishings for the project and blending one into the other, as ecosystems usually do. And therefore, we also propose these land bridges that connect not only people, but also nature together. This is an axon view of the park. And as you can see, it shows the diversity we were looking for. So it is part of a complex system. It's not only, let's say, the park above. It has a lot of underground spaces. It connects to a metro station, and it connects to a lot of the underground buildings around it. So it is a complex system, but let's say it is specifically this way of looking at the world in systems that we want to push. You know, how can we build more complex systems that what we are already doing, so that, let's say, we can thrive and nature can also thrive. Here we start with the, let's say, wetland areas, and you see that both like the aesthetic of it, but like the plant selection is specific, you know, for the wetland area. But below it, we also have a series of spaces, even sports hubs, you know, so that people, let's say, have cultural activities to develop. Here's a section of it. And in the section here, you see first the complexity of a project like this, but also, for example, you can see that we are actually taking a, like every planter has 1 meter, 2 meters, 3 meters sometimes of soil, so that we can actually build rich ecosystems. And here, let's say, you see an image of that area. This is what we're looking for in terms of the below ground space. But let's say then when you move further, you see the artificial ponds, and we're trying to build, let's say, an artificial ecosystem that can help the city when it rains. And also we're designing these small pavilions and architecture that integrates with the environment. Then we move into the jungle area, and in the jungle area, you really see like you really have a jungle feeling towards it. So obviously it also connects to the spaces below, but let's say above ground, and here you see in the section the size of the soil, so that we can actually build a jungle, you know. And this is the image from that area. So you can actually feel like in a tropical jungle. It's much more shaded. What we want to do is even like generate that sensation that you're out of the city in a way. And when you go underground, that you'll have connection to also other type of cultural spaces. Then let's say if we move further, we have like the bamboo areas where, let's say, this part is more like the traditional public spaces. But here we have these big pavilions and canopies, so that we provide shaded areas. We include water systems in there, which the idea is that they can refresh the air much better, because the heat in Shenzhen is actually quite aggressive. And also, let's say, how can we include programs that are that need bigger areas for more people? how it connects to the metro area, that is important. So here maybe you see an image of a more traditional public space, but let's say what is important for us, it's the combination and the relationship between them. It's not about building, let's say, completely secluded areas for nature, or let's say completely hardscapes for people, but combining them. Let's say that it's a big area where you have the traditional functions you would have in a metro system, and above ground. And I wanted to share with you this because we're trying to take this idea of the biotopes to the extremes to see what we can learn from it. So what we took is the idea of architecture. How can we start working with almost like if we were working with rocks? So we started carving out these elements that become small pavilions where you can have lunch, where you can just talk with some friends or meditate a little bit. You see these elements appearing within the jungle so that you can actually go into them and have a good time. We try to use different types of material. We're trying to move away from concrete. It's not easy, but I think it's a necessity for the state of the world. Like concrete is super, a very hard pollutant, and there are other ways of building that we are pushing. It's not easy, and we will see how far we can get to in this particular case, but we will try nonetheless. These are some plans of these big pavilion spaces that we're designing for the city, so that you can actually enjoy nature. And we wanted it to be very open. Weather in Shenzhen is always great, so it is definitely worth to be open, and you just need a little bit of shade. But it, like, the concept has to be taken to its fullest extent. So as we were telling you, we're trying to, let's say, build ecosystems, and we're working with experts so that, let's say, we really do have dense and rich natural environment. Here are some planting schemes, and you can see the diversity these have. So it's not only just placing trees one after the other, but let's say learning from the existing ecosystems and bringing the plants that are actually from that system. So we've been very fortunate because most cities try to have a limited number of vegetation that they use for their cityscapes. But in this particular case, we've been fortunate enough that the city officials understand the concept and want to push it further. So we have a huge variation of plants that are basically selected because they are part of these ecosystems. And we have obviously the high vegetation, the mid-height vegetation, and the low vegetation. When you move to the jungle, this changes dramatically because, let's say, the ecosystem changes dramatically too. Here you can see some examples of the vast array of plants we're selecting for these different environments. And also, let's say, within the bamboo areas, which, let's say, are more typical public spaces, but still have a dense variety, a great variety of elements and vegetation. And we're also pushing this idea like even further with the pavement system. So it's not only about the vegetation, but it's also how we're doing pavement. Do we want the ground to be absorbent and to have a lot of retained water? Do we want it to filter it quickly? Do we want it to, let's say, fill in until the drainage system, let's say, filters the water back into the sewers? You know, what do we want the paving to do? So each of the different areas has a different paving design. You know, even, let's say, the bicycle routes have this little iconography within the pavement that shows that you are in the different ecosystems, because it's also about educating people and showing them where they are and let's say understanding that they are part of a bigger system. So we've had a lot of fun even like designing the crossroads so that, and the zebra spaces, so that we can cross easily, but people learn where they're at. here you can see the different materials we use, and that will help identify the different landscapes we're building. And finally, these are some images from the project itself. So what we want to do are, say, these spaces that are clearly China, that are clearly, let's say, diverse, and that they talk about the ecologies that are surrounding them. Now, finally, I wanted to share a quick video to show you guys what's happening with our first project, which was the forest park that I showed you in Shenzhen. So this is a video we're still working on, but I think portrays what I was talking to you guys about, even I think more clearly. And and I think these ideas of blending nature and culture, we only need to strengthen. For now, say we're mainly working these ideas within, let's say, our landscape projects, but we are starting to introduce them to our architecture proposals, competitions, and building designs. Obviously, it depends on the context and to see what we can implement and how. Here, basically, we're looking at the situation in Shenzhen and in the Guangming district, and here this video looks to show how do we interact with the surrounding urban elements in Guangming. And here you can start seeing, let's say, the different elements of the park. And I didn't explain this to you because obviously a project that is 600 hectares big takes a lot of time to explain, but let's say it is also where and how people can develop certain type of activities. So it's not only, let's say, about where the ecology is focused, but where, let's say, high impact activities are focused, which areas are for more contemplation, you know? How do we build a stronger ecosystem in that sense too? And the red path becomes the main connector of the whole park. And it is 5 kilometers long, and let's say, as you can see here, it basically connects city and forest. Here we're crossing the lake, which has most of the sports activities. And soon after, let's say, we start going up into the mountain and just enjoying the forest. Here you see how we try to also blend architecture and infrastructure, so that, let's say, the same elevated pathway contains the visitor centers, the towers, the different elements that are required for a park, so that we're trying to blend this idea of architecture and infrastructure and do only one intervention. The video has some music, but it didn't work in the trials we did before the lecture. So let's say we will publish it when the video is ready. But I think for now, it gives a pretty good idea of how, let's say, what we're intending to do, which, let's say, might look in some areas as a typical park, but when you look deeper into it, you see that, let's say, the dynamics we're trying to propose are different. This is one of the multi-fields that we were telling you about, that, let's say, organizes sports in a different way. And obviously, although, let's say, we're showing here like the typical activities, by organizing them around surfaces, you can actually enjoy and do other type of sports that are not necessarily thought of. And the Sports Center R&D that was showing in the last image shows that you can actually work and invent new sports and try to execute them in the multi-fields. Here you see the panorama tower that connects within the forest. This will be one of the widest and longest pedestrian walkways in the world, I think. This is the day where they started construction of the project. And this is already pictures from a couple of days ago. The project is well underway, and at least part of the entrance, the part that is more concentrated within the city, will be inaugurated by the end of July. Here you can already see the red path under construction. And here you can see the site of the construction well underway. This is the spiral ramp there, and you start seeing how everything slowly unfolds. And let's say that was the lecture for today. I wanted to share with you guys the projects we're doing, but also like the mindset behind these projects. And also invite you to, let's say, read these books or others around these subjects so that we can actually think of how can we change our way of looking at architecture and urban design because, let's say, our world requires it. Not because of the COVID, not because we have to keep social distancing, but because there are, let's say, these underlying narratives which are even more complex and even more important that we need to deal with in order to be sustainable in the long run. So thank you very much for viewing, and I think there will be some questions from the audience, and I'll give it a couple of minutes. So, okay, here I started getting them. Anastasia, okay. Thank you very much from the presentation. What do you feel is the greatest challenge when it comes to designing for environmental sustainability? I think the biggest challenge we have nowadays is that, let's say, we look at the world through the eyes of money and resources, and therefore it's very difficult to justify on balance sheets and financial forecasts to be able to justify the investments we need for the environment, to sustain the environment. Because for now we've been, and it's not only in architecture but in all parts of life and of work, we've been used to using natural resources with almost no cost. So that, because that cost has been hidden all of this time, it's very difficult to have people recognize that cost because it changes how, let's say, the economy works. And I think that is the biggest challenge, although it is urgent and we should, let's say, deal with it and change our mindset completely. We will have to convince a lot of people that, let's say, it is worth investing because our future depends on it. But capitalism has done a great job of trying to make everything else seem unimportant. And now we're seeing the effects of that. I think, for example, what's happening with the coronavirus only shows that, let's say, countries and cities that have been investing properly in building development, in cities, in culture, are the best ones off. And those that have neglected everything and, let's say, even prioritized economy over everything else are now suffering the consequences of this in a much greater way. Well, I think that's it for now. Yeah, okay. Then thank you very much. And yeah, see you next time.